Well, I must say that this video will be taking the place of our in-class meeting on Monday, April 8th. It's very interesting. We have a total solar eclipse Monday, and a lot of people wanted to go to that. So that was never a problem with me. But I just want to say I'm going to make a few comments on this video, but it doesn't take the place of actually reading the material. And you might say, Rod, what material are we talking about? Well, we're talking about here. And the last assessment we took last Wednesday, on the 3rd, was over chapter 13 and the lectures that occurred that week, especially Monday. So now we are going to be going through circadian rhythms, the clicks, I should say, melatonin, pineal gland 1 and 2, dairy, cattle, mares, sheep, and birds. And then you can see this link down here isn't hot yet, but I will, once I get this video made, I'll send it to YouTube and then I'll link it from here. But and I might send it up above too. I might make a link above in case you weren't in class where I said I was going to put it here. So yeah, that's what we're doing. So yeah, now I want to talk about circadian rhythms. These are the things that happen about 24 hours, once every 24 hours. Like I know in class, we've been talking about how cortisol, which sometimes is called a stress hormone, peaks out in the morning and it might go down lower and then low during the night and then peaks in the morning without stress. So that's a circadian rhythm of cortisol. And if you design experiments that don't take that into account, you might have a confounded data set. And we've talked about that. So let me look at this thing here. This is a diagram that somebody made, and I got it off Wikipedia, and Wikipedia said I should acknowledge the author, which I do have their link here that they said they were going to. So now let me get a laser pointer here. And really, this diagram starts down here. Hopefully you see me down at the 6 o'clock position, which is midnight. So they're showing you that for a lot of humans, I won't say most humans, but 2 a.m. in the morning is where you might have your deepest sleep. 4:30 at night is your lowest body temperature. And then as you get closer to daylight, things start waking up, and then it says melatonin secretion stops at 7:30. And of course that depends on the time, but this is about right. And then interesting, your BM might be likely in the morning. And then here we go again. Highest testosterone secretions are about at 9 a.m. And so when you design experiments, are you always taking blood samples at the same time? So then when you do look at hormonal variations due to supposedly your treatments, that the treatments are making a difference. Remember, we talked about confounding factors, confounded data. And then over here, your best coordination is at 14:30. That's military time. So that's 2:30 in the afternoon. And so, wow, best coordination at that time. So if you do something risky, maybe you should do it at 2:30 in the afternoon. Reaction time, that might be if you're doing gaming, online gaming. Maybe you should always start your stuff at 3:30. Anyway, 1700, which is 5 o'clock in the evening, it says you have your greatest cardiovascular efficiency. And it goes on from there. Highest body temperature, melatonin secretion starts down here because that's basically when the light disappears. And so that's kind of fun. I'm going to get back up here, make that small. And then here's the group of authors that made that diagram that I just showed. This work was done by Inkspace, and you see the person's name there, and you can see it. And then if you want to read the whole thing, you can pause the video. But on that click, I want to talk about how the circadian clock is in mammals, and it's what's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And that might be something that you're not familiar with. So I want to talk about neural nucleus or a nuclei. So here's what that is. It's not like one nucleus from one cell. A nucleus or a nuclei, in this case, when you're talking about the nervous system, it's like a group of cells. They all stay the same, and they all basically are controlling the same function. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN, is a distinct group of cells in the hypothalamus that work on this circadian clock. So that's what I want to say. Okay, the retina of the eye contains classical photoreceptors, and rods and cones. Rods tend to do the most night vision. Cones are more colorful and during the daylight. And you should know that all these things work together, and they come about, and this says they can be found in the fruit fly. But for most of our reading, I would say concentrate on the general or the mammals, I should say. And so here's another clip I got out of this reading called Circadian Rhythms. And I get my laser pointed here. And basically, it might say the risk of cancer can be somewhat attributed to circadian rhythms, which I found interesting. And then cognitive effects, that means how your brain is working. Reduced cognitive function has been associated with circadian misalignment. For example, shift workers that are mostly at night might have some problems. So display increased, okay. And so I think that's really what they're talking about is nighttime working. And then the other thing is a risk of dementia associated with chronic night shift workers. And it might be more expressed in individuals that are over 50 years of age. So a lot of complicating factors here. So now I just want to talk about some of the material that's on the click that's called melatonin. And of course, that is the hormone. And it ends up being, it was initially isolated from the pineal glands of cows in 1958. And what you should realize during the 50s and the 60s especially, they would take glands out of cows, sheep, pigs, isolate hormones, and then found out or tried to find out what they did, what these hormones did in these glands. So it's a little bit of history, and it's very interesting. And so one of the paragraphs here in this melatonin reading talks about how efficient blue light is. When we're talking about blue light inhibiting melatonin. And later on, if you looked at that click with a mare and that mask that this company is selling, it's blue light. So blue light has a very good suppressive effect on melatonin synthesis. And of course, we're talking about horses. Horses are long day breeders, which means shorter nights, which means shorter melatonin. So melatonin in those animals must inhibit ovarian activity. So if you have blue light, you can reduce the inhibition. And anyway, so blue light is the key here. Then it's talking about melatonin is metabolized, and it has a half-life of about 20 to 50 minutes, which is interesting to know. That's rather short, but not unexpectedly short. And then, so we know that it doesn't hang around a long time. And then down here at the measurement, for research and clinical purposes, melatonin in humans can be determined in saliva or blood plasma analysis. Well, the reason I put that there is it's so much easier to collect a saliva sample from an animal or person than blood plasma, right? Blood plasma, you would have to collect blood. If you're looking at the plasma, that means you have to have an anticoagulant in the tube when you're collecting the blood. Saliva seems to be much more stress-free, wouldn't you agree? So I'm going to get rid of that. Let's see. I'm trying to get my material here out of the way, and then we get this material. Come on. Oops. Okay. Here we go. Had a little problem. Anyway, vertebrates, melatonin is produced mostly at the night, and it's a small endocrine gland in the center of the brain. But notice it says it's outside the blood-brain barrier, and you should make sure you note that. It's not inside the blood-brain barrier. So it's outside the blood-brain barrier, and it's the hormone of darkness. And of course, the onset of melatonin at dusk promotes activity of nocturnal animals. So nocturnal animals might use that increase in melatonin to say, hey, let's go about our business. Okay, I'm going to get rid of that and then do one more paragraph here, because you should note that melatonin can be found in different foods, which I found fascinating. Bananas, plums, grapes, wine, beer, consumption of milk and sour cherries may improve sleep quality. Okay, so that's where that warm glass of milk at night comes by. Sour cherries is something I haven't heard of before, but that's good. That's very interesting. When humans consume foods rich in melatonin, the blood levels of melatonin increase significantly. So maybe here's another thing about if you're ever doing studies with humans or maybe even primates, is the diet of the animal or person changing melatonin levels independent of what you're trying to research? So, yeah, another interesting point there with confounding data. Okay, now I'm kind of summarizing the clicks that say pineal gland 1, pineal gland 2, but one was the much more complicated click. And I picked out some of these things here about a paragraph, and it was very interesting where they said rodents suggest that pineal gland influences the pituitary gland's secretions of these hormones. Now, almost nobody in the world calls follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone sex hormones. Nobody calls them that. You should know that FSH and LH are called gonadotropins. Gonad, Gonad, tropins, gonadotropins. Sex hormones, which is always a bad term, but that's usually referred to testosterone and estrogen and things coming from the gonads. So be careful about that. Well, then they talk about pinealectomy. We talked about that in class. That's where you remove the pineal gland. And years ago, that was often a procedure where you remove something and then you see what happened, or you wait to see what happened. Okay, so then the pineal gland has all these receptors, and then the receptors have to be bound by certain hormones. And then down here, studies in mice suggest that pineal-derived melatonin might have a part to play in new bone deposition. And then I added this here because on the pineal gland 1 website, there's a lot of stuff. And so let's just make an agreement. We'll stop right where it comes to clinical significance. Don't read past this red line that I'm making. And then, of course, I found an equine brain. So this happens to be an equine brain, which shows the location of the pineal gland. And on the left figure, you know that in class even, I said this would be the left hemisphere. Sorry, I'm looking for my thing. Yeah, left hemisphere. This would be rostral. This will be caudal. And the left hemisphere doesn't even look like it's been cut. And it hasn't, because there's 2 hemispheres and they're connected by the corpus callosum. And hopefully you remember my story about split brain patients. It's fantastic. And then down here is the pineal gland, and I'm going to enlarge that. And so the thing is, the pineal gland, it's singular. There's not 2, there's only 1, and it's at the very mid-sagittal plane of the animal. And there it is in this case, right here. And I'm going to move it over to the other diagram, which already had an enlargement. And there's the pineal gland right above the 3rd ventricle. And if you've never done anything with brains and don't know terminology, the third ventricle means this. A ventricle in the brain is full of fluid, cerebral spinal fluid. Now notice that ventricle is the same as the heart ventricle, left ventricle, right ventricle. So you should make sure you know ventricle is a term that means filled with some kind of fluid. And in this case, in the brain, the third ventricle is full of cerebral spinal fluid. And of course, maybe adding to this, you should know that when there's too much cerebral spinal fluid, that's when you get fluid on the brain, hydrocephalus. So hydrocephalus is when there's too much cerebral spinal fluid in the brain. Okay, now this is a little screen clip out of the article that's beneath the Dairy Cattle One link, which you have on your website. And one of the authors, which I don't have here, I think the authors were designated up there where I've got the red laser pointer. One was H.A. Tucker, and I know his middle name is Alan, so I call him H. Alan Tucker, was an incredible researcher for lactation studies in especially dairy cattle. So anytime I saw his name, and this is a review article, it's like, wow, this is something I can read and glean a lot on. So I'm going to open this up, highlight it a little bit, get back to my laser pointer, and galactopoietic, right up here, means increasing the secretion of milk. So it's kind of like not so much inducing, but it can mean that too. So, but in this case, it's more of having an additional effect. And so they're saying photoperiod of 16 hours light, 8 dark. We've talked about that in class. Has an effect on milk production. And so milk production, should know, there's hopefully my red laser pointer is showing up, is a summation of a lot of endocrine factors. And then one of our reading points, and it was on an assessment, I remember, I think there was something about what's the two main contributors to milk production. It was somatotropin, and then the other answer was insulin-like growth factors, factor 1, and that was what was important for milk production. Anyway, this article is very good. I'm going to try to get this up here a little bit for you. And make sure when you read it, you notice hormonal things. It's all about insulin-like growth factor 1, how things can be combined with BST. I'm down there in the lower left. And what's interesting about BST, the little b, capital S, capital T, means bovine somatotropin. Sometimes you'll see that as capital BST, bovine somatotropin again. And then sometimes there's a little R in front of BST, and that means recombinant bovine somatotropin. And basically that means, hey, I'm being made in a bacterium. So, yeah, let me get over here and get over to this other side. Yeah, but it's very interesting, and it's amazing, because if you're not familiar with BST, that's often injected into animals, dairy cattle. Milking more than twice a day, you can get more milk. And this talks about the endocrine mechanisms, which you should read. And look at this. It says long day periods may be acting via increases in circulating insulin-like growth factor 1. And you should know that that comes from the liver. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to introduce on that screen. So now this is the click on our reading that I showed at the beginning of this video, but it's called Mayors. And read what this company is selling, I guess I should say. But the point is, it's very clear here that there's this device emitting blue light. So blue light is the most efficient in sending a signal to the horse's brain, ends up being every brain, basically, for mammals, that the photoperiod is on. So if the photoperiod is on, that means melatonin is being inhibited and they're not getting as much melatonin. So in the horse, that stimulates reproduction. And it's, biology. So in the horse, light decreases melatonin synthesis, and that in turn stimulates reproductive activity. So, and then in the sheep, they're short day breeder. So then the less light they get, the more melatonin they get, and that stimulates reproduction. So it's a little confusing. Thank you, Mother Nature, but that's what we have to live with. Okay, now we're talking about the link that says Sheep 1 on that page that I showed at the beginning. And it's very interesting. This was done by, I think, some undergraduates. God bless them. They're working hard. And then I'm going to look at this left panel first, and I'm circling it, this left part of the diagram. And basically what they're saying is, there's the end of anestrus. That means whenever they stop being, I call it static, and they're going to recruit follicles to ovulate. And then you can see that down here. First ovulatory follicles. And then they say these follicles right here grow, they ovulate, they send E2 to the brain, but then when you say silent ovulation, that means the animal ovulates, but the silence means they're not displaying behavioral estrus. Silent ovulation is they're ovulating, but they're not showing any signs of estrus activity, distinct estrus activity. And so, unfortunately, then they looks like they have another panel here that says this is something different, but it's not. Silent ovulation is no behavioral estrus. So what they're showing here correctly is there's an ovulation, and then there's a CL formed, but you wouldn't need to write down 3 because you just put 1 down. P4 is often the abbreviation for progesterone. So they're saying after the silent ovulation, which could also be written here, P4 primes the brain. And so whenever they ovulate again, they might show estrus after this priming. And that's what this third panel is. They have another follicle growing. It's going to ovulate. It releases E2, which is the symbol for estradiol 17 beta. And then you get a full-fledged first behavioral estrus that you can detect or the RAM can detect. So in some cases, when animals come back into estrus, they have this silent ovulation. Nobody knows what's going on. And they're not being bred because they're not coming into estrus. But then the progesterone that's formed from the corpus luteum then sets them up for having a behavioral estrus. So it ends up being after an estrus, maybe the brain isn't ready to show estrus, and the presence of P4 says, let's reset your brain so then that you can show estrus. And finally, this click that's called Bird's Photoperiod, I'm up on the top now, was made by a very smart student, Grace, and she did this video. I think it's about 7 minutes long. Make sure you listen to it. And she has some summary slides here of how birds are able to get light through the skull, and that's what's called the extra retinal photoreceptors, whereas mammals have to have an intact optic nerve. I really should try to bring in the horse eye I have with a great big optic nerve. I'm going to try to do that for class before I forget, because it's quite spectacular how big the optic nerve is in a large animal. But this is a great video by a wonderful person. And then the other thing I wanted to say about this video is Grace makes a point about how the photoperiod can influence the amount of GnRH released. And we've talked about GnRH before. You can buy it commercially. It's a very small peptide hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone. And if the hypothalamus releases it or you inject it into the animal, then the pituitary gland releases LH and FSH. Got to make sure my laser pointer is showing. And so it can start reproduction, basically. Okay, I'm going to end there because it's got longer than I thought, but it's kind of like taking the place of Monday, April 8th, when people are going to look for the solar eclipse. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.